Beneath the marble courtyards of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace lies a silence older than the empire itself, a silence that has been sealed, guarded, and feared for centuries. In 1924, when a team of Turkish archaeologists first broke through the bricks of a forgotten passageway, they thought they had uncovered another wine cellar, another relic of Ottoman opulence. What they found instead made half the team flee before the first day was over. The walls were not lined with treasures or jewels, but with frescoes. Disturbing, intimate frescoes painted in exquisite Ottoman style, depicting scenes that no holy man could ever bless. Naked bodies, ritual formations, symbols of crescent moons entwined with chains. These were not artistic fantasies. They were instructions. Manuals. The walls of the chamber were a textbook of obedience through pleasure and pain, a script for turning flesh into faith. Government officials quickly sealed the rooms again. The discovery was classified as a matter of national dignity. But fragments of those images survived, sketches smuggled out by terrified scholars who understood that what they'd found was not eroticism, but a map of the empire's hidden machinery. 3 years ago, a Turkish archivist leaked what the authorities had long denied existed: palace records describing the same rituals, the same terminology. His notes claimed these chambers were not an anomaly, they were the foundation. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had refined sexual domination into a system of governance, dressing it in divine silk and scripture. Forget the golden domes, the poetry, the dazzling courts of sultans and viziers. Behind every shimmering curtain was a theology of submission, a doctrine that worshipped control disguised as holiness. Every ritual, every decree, every whispered prayer inside these walls fed into the same idea, that the body could be broken in the name of heaven, and obedience could be harvested from desire. Tonight, we open those sealed chambers again, not with shovels, but with truth. Because what was buried under Topkapi was not just stone and bone. It was the soul of an empire that learned to sanctify suffering, to call slavery sacred, and to turn human pleasure into a weapon of control. Welcome to the hollow throne, where faith and flesh became one, and paradise began in the dark. When Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, his empire was baptized not in faith, but in fear. While historians wrote about his triumphal march through the city gates, few dared to record his first royal decree, the creation of the sacred service system. Officially, it was described as a holy initiative to honor divine womanhood. In truth, it was the moment religion became a weaponized theater of sexual control. From every conquered province, Greece, the Balkans, Armenia, and beyond, young girls were taken. Some as young as 10. They were renamed Brides of the Prophet, a title that sounded heavenly in sermons but hid a reality too grotesque for scripture. Their families were told their daughters had been chosen for paradise. They never saw them again. The girls were taken to the great courtyards of the Suleimani Mosque complex, where their purification rituals began. For 3 days, they were starved, deprived of sleep, and bathed in freezing water scented with rose oil and myrrh. Ottoman records called this spiritual preparation. But diaries from the palace physicians described it more accurately: psychological dismantling. Every act of cleansing stripped away identity, leaving only obedience. On the 3rd night, the priests entered. What followed was called the divine marriage ceremony, a ritual union between servant and faith. But there was no marriage, only the breaking of children, methodical and public, while clerics recited verses about divine submission. The walls of the blessed chamber were painted with calligraphy praising purity as the young girls screamed. And as the last candle burned out, their names were recorded in gold ink into scrolls titled Servants of Paradise. By 1600, there were more than 15,000 brides of the Prophet serving across Ottoman territories, in mosques, schools, and noble households. They were trained not to question, not to feel. Their bodies became offerings, their silence a form of worship. The system was so refined that even foreign ambassadors mistook it for sacred devotion. Venetian envoy Marco Foscarini wrote, "What I witnessed was not religion, but sanctified destruction." The sacred service system was the empire's perfect lie, a machine that turned faith into obedience, and obedience into power. It taught the world that even the most unholy acts can wear a halo when sanctified by authority. And it proved that in the Ottoman Empire, holiness was not about salvation, it was about control. In 1608, when the marble floors of the Suleimani Mosque cemetery were first lifted for restoration, workers found something no prayer could cleanse. The corpses of women, dozens of them, had been disturbed, their shrouds untied, their remains rearranged as though they had been touched long after death. At first, the discovery was dismissed as grave robbery. But the pattern was too deliberate, too ritualistic. What emerged from those tombs was not theft, it was theology. Ottoman records, written in coded script, spoke of a secret rite called purification for paradise. It was said that the most beautiful women of the empire, after their passing, were to receive a final blessing from the living, a ritual meant to ensure their souls ascended cleansed and perfect. But what those blessings entailed was something no sacred book ever sanctioned. According to the recovered journals of Imam Hassan al-Damashqi, dated 1612, the faithful believed that spiritual energy could pass between flesh and spirit, even after death. The vessel must be prepared for divine pleasure, he wrote, so that she may serve eternally in paradise. The phrase, prepared for divine pleasure, appeared in hundreds of burial records across the empire, a euphemism hiding acts too monstrous to name. This was not isolated depravity. It was an organized practice, taught and justified through doctrine. In 1534, Sultan Suleiman's clerics established Madrasa al-Marda, the school of the dead, a place where imams were trained to perform corpse consecrations. There, amid smoke and scripture, young theologians learned to recite blessings while manipulating what remained of the departed, convinced that the soul's purity required physical ritual. By the mid-1600s, the practice had become standardized. Ottoman graveyards from Damascus to Cairo contained the same signs: unsealed tombs, bones positioned in ceremonial symmetry, jars of perfumed oil beside twisted shrouds. It was as if the empire had found a way to turn even death into devotion. For centuries, the clerics spoke of this as compassion, a gift for the dead. But behind every whispered prayer lay the same sickness, a belief that power could be stolen from the lifeless, that holiness could be proven through desecration. And so, in the empire that called itself divine, even the grave was not a refuge. Faith reached into the tomb, and the dead were never allowed to rest. For centuries, the Ottoman throne appeared unshakable, draped in gold, fortified by divine right, and surrounded by the illusion of royal perfection. But behind those velvet curtains, the empire was conducting an experiment so grotesque that even its architects whispered of it only in coded language. It began in 1481, under Sultan Bayezid II, when a new law was quietly added to the royal succession code, one that required every heir to unite blood within the sacred circle. The phrase sounded poetic. In truth, it meant incest. Royal sons were commanded to marry their sisters before coronation. Mothers and aunts were designated as teachers of divine affection. Behind closed doors, the empire's future rulers were being psychologically dismantled under the guise of holy education. The goal was not purity of lineage, but purity of obedience. Palace physicians recorded the transformation in secret journals. One entry from Dr. Yusuf al-Andalusi described Sultan Selim's condition with clinical horror. His Majesty demonstrates the expected symptoms: moral confusion, dependence upon clerical instruction, and the inability to discern divine will from personal desire. What the doctor could not say outright was clear: the empire was manufacturing broken kings. Every act of sacred union carved deeper fractures into the royal mind. By the time these princes ascended the throne, their understanding of love, power, and guilt had fused into one. They ruled not through strength, but through submission to those who had shaped them. The empire's real power, the viziers, the imams, the scholars of obedience, ruled from behind silk screens. In the private chambers of Topkapi Palace, portraits of family devotion hung beside the truth trembling sons who feared their mothers, daughters who became symbols of divine blood, and advisors who ensured the lineage of trauma continued. Incest was not a scandal. It was policy. The results were devastating. Records show royal children born pale, frail, and trembling, often dying before their 10th year. Those who survived inherited not wisdom, but madness, eyes empty, smiles hollow. And yet, the empire called it providence. Through sanctified corruption, the Ottoman elite discovered the perfect formula for control: destroy a ruler's mind, and his body will obey. The empire did not need strong kings. It needed puppets, souls so fractured that even their sins could be called sacred. And within the candlelit silence of Topkapi, the machine of divine obedience kept turning. Every empire builds its glory on spectacle. For the Ottomans, that spectacle was sanctified pain. Beneath banners of gold and silk, the festivals of purity transformed brutality into celebration, the empire's most disturbing marriage of faith and power. They were annual events, announced with drums and incense. Streets from Bursa to Istanbul filled with processions of clerics, nobles, and thousands of spectators dressed in white. The air reeked of perfume and smoke, a veil over what was about to unfold. At the center of each ceremony stood a raised marble platform, the throne of purity. There, the chosen vessels from conquered provinces, young girls scarcely more than children, stood trembling under the weight of divine expectation. To the crowd, this was a ritual of blessing, a union between the empire and the divine feminine. Imams recited verses that promised salvation through submission. Governors boasted of how their city's ceremony would please the eyes of heaven. Behind the chants, wagers were made, on how long the chosen would endure, how loudly they would pray, how faithfully they would obey. When the rituals began, the cheering drowned the cries. Musicians played flutes and drums to mask the horror, transforming suffering into melody. Ottoman chroniclers described the events as festivals of sacred endurance. But one Venetian diplomat wrote a single sentence in his diary: "It was not faith I witnessed, it was ecstasy built on agony." By dawn, the marble platforms were washed clean. Survivors, if there were any, were carried away in gilded litters, their names entered into the empire's sacred service registry. They were destined for the network of holy hostels, the religious brothels that lined the trade routes from Anatolia to Egypt. Those who perished were declared martyrs of purity, their remains buried beneath the mosques their suffering had helped finance. By 1600, the festivals of purity had become the Ottoman Empire's most profitable institution. Each event brought waves of pilgrims, donations, and taxes disguised as religious contributions. The mosques glittered with gold purchased by pain. The empire had found a way to turn mass suffering into both entertainment and income, a faith built on applause. And so, beneath the beauty of Ottoman architecture, beneath the music and the incense, an entire civilization learned to cheer for cruelty. The festivals of purity were not about devotion. They were about control, a public theater where obedience was pleasure, and violence became divine. Under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached its golden age of conquest, art, and architecture. Yet beneath the domes of beauty and faith, the empire was building something far darker: laboratories of human design. Historians called them breeding compounds. Officially, they were institutes of divine perfection. In reality, they were prisons where the empire learned to manufacture obedience. Hidden deep in the Anatolian mountains, these compounds were surrounded by high stone walls and guarded by janissaries sworn to secrecy. Inside, men and women were not treated as subjects, but as materials, chosen for their strength, beauty, or submission. Ottoman physicians, mathematicians, and clerics worked together, recording every trait, every reaction, every offspring. Their goal was terrifyingly simple: to create the perfect servant, one who would never resist, never question, never dream. Records found centuries later described the process with clinical detachment. Children born inside the compounds were taken from their parents at birth and raised without names. They were taught only prayer, posture, and silence. Punishment was swift, reward non-existent. Their bodies were trained to bow, their minds conditioned to surrender. To the empire, this was not cruelty, it was progress. Dr. Mehmet Çelebi, Suleiman's chief physician, wrote proudly in his encrypted journals, "Fourth-generation subjects display ideal compliance. Resistance behaviors have been fully eliminated through selective lineage." His words revealed the horror: these were not people, but projects. Lineages were tracked like livestock, categorized by temperament, voice, and physical grace. By 1650, over 30,000 optimized subjects served in Ottoman palaces and mosques. They were praised as divine creations, human beings who embodied spiritual devotion and absolute submission. The empire paraded them in public ceremonies, their calm expressions mistaken for holiness. None spoke. None disobeyed. They had been bred to please both heaven and the state. The scholar who uncovered these records centuries later wrote that the compounds represented the empire's true genius, not in warfare or architecture, but in re-engineering the soul. The Ottomans had found a way to breed obedience itself, to shape faith through flesh and fear. And in that revelation lies the empire's darkest truth: they no longer needed to conquer nations by sword. They could build an empire of bodies, born to kneel. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire had mastered obedience through fear. But fear, like faith, demanded precision. And so the empire founded the academies of sacred pain, institutions where cruelty became curriculum and agony was perfected as an art. Hidden beneath the lower courts of Topkapi and scattered through the empire's provinces, these academies were presented as theological schools. Their official purpose: to study the limits of human endurance in pursuit of divine understanding. What they truly produced were engineers of torment, men who could make others kneel not through death, but through calculated survival. Graduates were known as servants of endurance. They were trained to inflict pain as precisely as a surgeon makes an incision, to stretch suffering to its fullest without allowing mercy or escape. The training halls were cold stone chambers lined with instruments that looked more like sacred relics than weapons. Iron, leather, and wood were engraved with verses about purification through trial. To the instructors, each scream was not cruelty, but revelation. The young Ottoman scholar, sent to document the program for the court, described his first visit in a letter never meant to be read: "I saw men studying pain as others study astronomy, charting its patterns, naming its laws, seeking perfection in the breaking of spirit." The academies held competitions. Students demonstrated new methods of endurance before the senior clerics, methods that left the victim alive, docile, and compliant. Those who excelled received ceremonial blades dipped in gold, symbols of mastery. Upon graduation, they were certified, ranked, and assigned to noble households or military units. Some were even sent abroad as diplomatic gifts, emissaries of Ottoman efficiency in the science of control. One surviving ledger from 1623 records a shipment to Venice, 3 specialists in divine punishment, trained in restraint and revival. Within decades, the practice had spread across Europe's elite circles, the Ottoman legacy exported under the guise of scholarship. Inside those academies, suffering became sacred, and cruelty was no longer a sin but a skill, a tool of governance honed through discipline and prayer. By perfecting pain, the empire proved that control did not require swords or armies. It required education, and the quiet conviction that even horror, when ritualized, could be made holy. In 1587, under the reign of Sultan Murad III, the empire founded what it called the Institute of Sacred Psychology. Officially, it was a center for spiritual medicine. In truth, it was the Ottoman Empire's most chilling invention, a laboratory for the study of human obedience through pain. The institute's marble facade rose like a temple near the shores of the Bosphorus. Inside, scholars, imams, and physicians gathered to study not the body, but the mind, and how it could be reshaped. The project's directive, written in gold ink, declared, to understand the limits of the human soul and the use of agony to purify it. But purification, in Ottoman terminology, meant domination. The young Ottoman scholar, newly appointed as a scribe to the project, was told that he would be recording reactions of the divine spirit to earthly pain. What he witnessed instead were human experiments. Subjects drawn from the empire's prisons and orphanages were placed under observation. They were deprived, humiliated, and broken, all under the supervision of men who believed they were studying holiness itself. Every gesture was measured. Every scream was documented. Physicians recorded how pain changed the pupils, the breathing, the heartbeat. Imams noted how suffering altered prayer patterns and emotional response. Over time, they began to see patterns that terrified even them. Repeated trauma did not just destroy the will, it rewired it. Victims became calmer, more compliant, less prone to rebellion. The discovery transformed the empire. The scholars realized that obedience could be inherited. Children born to broken parents showed the same submission, the same absence of resistance. The Institute called it inherited devotion. Modern science would call it intergenerational trauma. The Ottomans called it perfection. By 1700, entire communities within the empire, labor colonies, religious sects, servant classes, were quietly selected for exposure to controlled suffering. The goal was no longer to punish or convert, but to breed psychological compliance itself. Dr. Omar al-Baghdadi, director of the Institute, summarized their achievement in his final report: "Through trauma, the mind can be remade. Through generations, faith can be engineered." The young scholar who copied that line wrote another beneath it, in trembling ink: "They have discovered how to create peace without mercy." The Institute of Sacred Psychology did not die with the empire. Its methods, the manipulation of pain, the conditioning of the helpless, became the blueprint for every system that sought to rule not just the body, but the mind. In the name of faith, they had built the first true science of control. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached its most terrible form of devotion, faith that demanded servitude beyond the grave. The doctrine was simple and horrifying: a righteous man would be attended in paradise by women chosen and prepared in this world. But for the empire, this belief became policy. In royal cemeteries and provincial towns alike, women were selected to accompany deceased officials into eternity. They were called the brides of heaven. Ottoman burial records describe the ritual with serene detachment, purified and consecrated for the afterlife. In reality, it meant execution disguised as sanctification. The young Ottoman scholar, by then an archivist for the imperial court, found evidence of this practice hidden among tax ledgers, shipments of silk, gold oil, and linen, all marked for burial accompaniment. The numbers were staggering. Tombs unearthed centuries later revealed the truth: entire chambers filled with the bodies of women laid beside their masters, their hands positioned in gestures of eternal prayer. Dr. Talib Khan, an Ottoman physician-archaeologist, recorded the grisly discovery in his notes: they prepared the dead for service, believing heaven required continuity of control. The empire's theology had erased the boundary between life and death. Slavery became eternal. But what happened among the living was no less horrifying. Every spring, the empire hosted the Festival of Divine Union. It was a state-sanctioned ritual of temporary devotion, requiring every woman between the ages of 12 and 45 to serve as property of the empire for 3 days. Markets closed, marriages were suspended, and clerics proclaimed that through public union, the empire renewed its covenant with God. In truth, it was organized violation on a national scale, an event that turned the female body into currency. Taxes were paid in flesh. Wealthy nobles and visiting traders paid temple fees for holy participation. By the mid-1600s, the festivals generated more revenue than any trade route or battlefield victory. Entire mosques, schools, and barracks were funded by the proceeds of what the empire called sacred renewal. The scholar's final notes describe Istanbul after one such festival: the city stank of perfume and silence. No one spoke of what had happened, but every minaret gleamed brighter. In the Ottoman Empire, faith, economy, and desire had become one machine, polished by blood, perfumed by prayer, and powered by the suffering of women who served both in life and in death. And beneath its shining domes, the silence of the enslaved became the empire's most enduring hymn. Centuries have passed since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, yet its shadow still moves among us. The domes have faded, the palaces have turned to museums, but the machinery it built, the systems of obedience, the science of pain, the theology of control, never truly vanished. They simply changed their language. Modern traffickers call it conditioning. Psychologists call it trauma bonding. Governments call it stability. But all of them echo the same discovery made within those marble halls of Istanbul, that a human being can be broken into silence, reshaped into devotion, and convinced that submission is salvation. Today, those old Ottoman techniques live on in the world's darkest corners. In human trafficking networks that teach recruits to obey through alternating cruelty and reward. In religious cults that demand suffering as proof of faith. In political regimes that manipulate fear to create loyalty. They all follow the same principle that the Institute of Sacred Psychology once proclaimed: control the pain, and you control the soul. Investigators who trace these networks often stumble on disturbing parallels. Manuals describing how to erase individuality, create compliance, and train subjects to recruit others. Their structure mirrors the Ottoman books of obedience almost line for line. Even the language has survived: purification, initiation, transcendence. The young Ottoman scholar who once recorded his empire's horrors would recognize this world. He would see his meticulous notes reborn in modern laboratories, interrogation rooms, and social systems that disguise domination as guidance. He would realize that the experiment never ended, it evolved. Dr. Sarah Chen, a modern expert on trauma inheritance, summarized it with chilling precision: they were centuries ahead of us in understanding how to pass obedience through generations. The Ottoman academies may have closed, but their blueprints, psychological, institutional, spiritual, remain etched into the global psyche. And just like the citizens of that empire, we too learn to look away. We praise beauty, worship power, and pretend not to see the blood beneath the foundation. That is how the cycle continues, not through monsters, but through ordinary people who choose comfort over truth. To understand the Ottoman Empire is to understand how evil survives, not as chaos, but as order, not as rebellion, but as religion. Because darkness does not die when exposed to light. It adapts, sanctifies itself, and calls the adaptation progress. And in every age, it waits for those willing to mistake obedience for peace. The truth, however disturbing, remains our only weapon against that silence. Knowledge is resistance. Memory is defiance. And the courage to see clearly is the only act of faith that still matters.